Thank you very much, Director General Albert von Jaarsveld, Director Dr. Elena Rovenskaya, Director Professor Alexia Fünkerns-Prskowitz, Michael Clegg, Monica Bauer, Sergei Sichov, Sherry Maurice Edwards, and Julia Schaubach for inviting to this exciting event on systems analysis for reducing footprints and enhancing resilience. And today I want to speak a bit about my poster that I submitted, and it is going to be informing about quantifying science diplomacy and index and application on climate justice. So let me first talk a bit about science diplomacy. And the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis is, for me, really at the forefront of one of these institutions that really had science diplomacy ingrained in its institutional culture. And science diplomacy came out of the idea that some problems are simply too urgent, too large, and too complex, so that their solution can be delayed or halted by politics, by national interests. For instance, global warming, global pandemics, but also the renewed East-West tensions are examples of these problems that are simply too large and too dangerous for the entire world population, that you would receive or just rest in letting regular diplomacy or national interests and politics reign the solution. And the idea is to focus on science and constructive problem solving skills, leaving aside any political realities, any country differences, or historical or institutional denominations, political biases, and national customary practices in tackling these large-scale problems. And historically, we can tell a beautiful story of science diplomacy starting in the 1930s, but then really being at the height of the Cold War area. Institutions like Bretton Woods institutions that sprung out of World War II and predecessors that came out of World War I with the League of Nations, and then later on the UN, World Bank, IMF institutions really started connecting scientists with diplomats and diplomacy in order to really focus on a common problem solution. But there are also these more non-political institutions like the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis that really practiced scientific exchange. We also see on an international basis, for instance, the YSSP program that was created by Dr. Roger Levien, but also in the US you saw the Fulbright Scholarship, the Rhodes Scholarship, the Max Cade Foundation Scholarship in New York. Those are these ideas that you would connect scientists that also think about policy programs and really connect via scientific facts. In the EU we saw the Erasmus, Socrates, but also Mundus Scholarship exchange really also fostering this idea of science diplomacy. We also see international conferences like the UN Conferences of the Parties, especially with a focus on climate change, but also the United Nations Unequal World Conferences that started a few years ago, and this year we will have the fourth conference hosted in New York City on an unequal world, pressing for issues and scientific diplomatic solutions for these global common problems. Certain topics that in the past have been solved by science diplomacy are the environment. We think about the ozone layer protection. We think about the conferences of the parties, but also the sustainable development solution and the idea that was pre-negotiated at IIASA are beautiful examples how science and diplomacy can unite in order to solve problems efficiently and quickly. Or we had East-West coming together for the common idea of a space exploration or a nuclear disarmament in the past. As we have reached a new East-West tension era, we also have IIASA revitalizing this idea of science diplomacy. We saw the Vienna Statement on Science Diplomacy coming out in 2022, where it was stated that science diplomacy builds scientific collaborations to address common and shared problems, and it was advocated for free and open exchange of scientific ideas and information that is building on the integrity of research and the societal responsibility focus of science in order to foster a freedom of cooperation. But in all these interesting ideas and the renewed attention to science diplomacy during the East-West tension, here we see a beautiful piece that just came out in April 2022 in Nature, with different co-authors. Director General Albert von Jaarsveld is one of them. Also the Columbia University economist Jeffrey Sachs, who really make the argument that science diplomacy is most important to find a common ground on the renewed East-West tensions. But in all of these ideas of really focusing on scientific data and finding a bridge of mutual scientific understanding for global solutions, and the benefits that science can learn from the diplomatic tact and the appreciation for different opinions, whereas diplomacy can really benefit from the rigor that is in scientifically quantified results and data-driven information. In all of this, we to this day do not exactly know what countries can be at the forefront of science diplomacy, and what countries, when you apply it to the common problem of climate change, might be really at the forefront and have the best starting grounds to kick us off and unite the world for a common science diplomacy solution in climate change mitigation and adaptation. We do not have a quantification, and we do not have a ranking in what kind of countries could really lead the world. And that was pretty much the starting ground of my research contribution. First of all, I created the very first science diplomacy index based on the components of the academia quota per country. I took World Bank data. I think that is derived from the UNESCO that talks about the educational attainment, at least at the bachelor's or equivalent level of the population of 25 years and older, and takes a cumulative percent of the population. So that pretty much speaks to how many people are academics in a country. Then I took the world ranking of academic institutions of Webometrics, and they had this ranking of universities. And then I took, first of all, the ranking of universities per country, but then I also weighted them by the relevance. So I recreated a more sophisticated index that really looks into how many academic institutions does a country offer, and then also how relevant are they on the international scene. And then the third component are diplomatic relations in embassies, consulates, and other representations total. And I took this global diplomacy index. For most of the data was for most recent years in 2019, so pre-COVID-19. And what I first created was this science diplomacy index out of these components, and the redder the country and the more yellowish the country, the more the country has good starting grounds in practicing science diplomacy. And here you can see that the US, Russia, but also India and some European countries and Brazil are really at the forefront of practicing science diplomacy. Here you see the country rankings with the name of the country. So the US, the Russian Federation, Japan, India, UK, Brazil, France, Germany, South Korea, Mexico, Indonesia, Spain, Canada, Poland, Italy, Australia, and the Netherlands are really at the forefront that can push for science diplomacy on a global scale based on the academic institutions, the academic credentials of its nationals, and based on the diplomatic ties all over the world of these countries. Then now when you have this idea of who can lead on science diplomacy, when you look into one specific most important problem of these days, which is climate justice, then you can also phase in and think about what countries have good starting grounds to practice climate justice, and what countries potentially also have a heightened responsibility to practice climate justice with science diplomacy means. So first of all, why climate change? As you can see here, this is the world surface temperature since its recordings in 1891, and you can see definitely an upwards trend. So the climate is getting hotter, the temperature is getting hotter. And then this was part of my YSSP, which I enjoyed spending at IIASA in 2016. I looked into the diverse impact of climate change around the globe, only from an economic perspective. And I want to emphasize this is only from an economic lens. It does not include certain risk propensities of certain countries. This is only looking from an economic perspective in order to have a very clean, focused model at first, and then phase in other factors and other regional variables. So when you only look into the country propensities to be impacted by climate change on an economic level, you can say that countries around the world have really different starting grounds on country temperatures. We all agree that Canada has a different mean temperature than Mexico, for instance. Then countries really will vary by GDP composition per country. So countries vary how much they produce in the agriculture sector, in the service sector, in the industry sector. And countries also are completely different around the globe what the top temperature for productivity based on their GDP sector composition is. So agriculture, service, and industry has different peak conditions, temperature-wise, when people can be most productive. And with the GDP composition being different around the globe and different top temperatures for agriculture, service, and industry sectors, you can say that the countries really vary around the globe in their propensity to be economically productive under the condition of global warming. And here you see the world map. The greener the country, the more the country has time ahead in this model in order to reach the peak economic productivity per temperature. And the green countries have the most time ahead and follow the yellow countries that are around peak condition in the perspective of climate change over the next 100 years. And the red countries will have run out of time in 100 years for optimal condition per climate. So when I also plot this climate change winners and losers, and I only do this in relation to each other and only based on economic terms. So when I plot this, here is a bar chart. You can see in the left chart, I only plot 1/3 of the countries that have the most time ahead in green, 1/3 of the countries in red that will have run out of time in 100 years, and 1/3 of the countries in yellow around the peak condition in 100 years. But then when I shift these bars and I plot not 1/3 of the countries that have a rising or that have a rising GDP prospect in the next 100 years based on climate change in economic terms, but I only plot 1/3 of the gains here in green, you can see that this green bar really shifts up. So you see this inequality that only a few countries really have a rising prospect in terms of economic prospect and they will win a lot in the next 100 years economically based on the temperature getting hotter. And then in order to drive this point of the inequality that lies in climate justice pledges or that leads to climate justice pledges, we can also see that I already see in the data that the countries that have a rising GDP prospect are also the countries that have a significant positive correlation with self-reported percentages of greenhouse gas emissions. So the countries that have the most time ahead are also the countries that are causing the problems in greenhouse gas emissions. We also already see a drive of immigration into the countries that have rising GDP prospects in a significant positive, highly significant positive correlation between climate-induced migration patterns and being on the climate winning side in the relative terms. And the climate-induced financial inflow, we already see also that there are financial inflows in the climate change winning territories in a significant positive correlation, but there are no foreign direct investment outflows. So there's something going on. There's an inequality in the diverse impact of climate change around the globe. There's this inequality that only a few countries will be winning, that we have only these few countries are also potentially causing the problem in greenhouse gas emissions, and that they get also migration streams and financial inflows into these countries. Then this idea was first to think about redistribution strategies. So if you take one thing away from this presentation, please take this. I only show these relative short-term gains of climate change in some countries in order to drive the point that we have to think about redistribution. And I base this really on the ethics of redistribution, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. You can also rewrite into a climatorial imperative. No matter how good or bad the condition outlook is in your individual country, you realize that the whole problem, climate change, imposes major risks and problems and really degradation of human living conditions. So you have to do something, even if you're on the short-term economic gains prospect. Hans Jonas, a professor at the New School, really applied this also, this categorical imperative of Kant onto the environment. So not only should people only engage in actions that they want to have incurred onto them. This is the Kantian categorical imperative. Hans Jonas also said not only should people engage in actions to the environment that they want to have incurred on them. So there's this balanced state of entropy with the environment in Hans Jonas' interpretation of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. We, of course, also have John Rawls, who had this idea of the veil of ignorance. No matter how winning or losing you are in an ethical dilemma, you should neglect your individual gains or loss prospects, but evaluate an ethical dilemma only from a collective viewpoint. And here also you come immediately to the conclusion that climate change should be averted, and there should be potentially a redistribution mechanism. We also have Dimitri Nikolin at the New School these days, at the philosophy department, really applying all these ideas onto the larger scale environmental conditions, the John Rawlsian argument, and making the case that countries should come together and negotiate a solution, whether or not they are on a winning or on a losing path. So when I first thought about redistribution, I actually took the climate gains loss and gains prospect and looked at it from an individual national inhabitants perspective. And so I took the GDP per inhabitant and the gains and loss prospect per inhabitant and came up with this solution. You can see here in the graph, the greener the graph, the more the country should should be redistributing to red and yellow countries. Here you see this political infeasibility. I had the pleasure and honor to present this at the National Academy of Sciences in the US. And there, when I brought this chart, I really saw the audience. Some people were civil servants who also served in wars. Here you saw that people said the political infeasibility in this argument to say that potentially the northern countries should be paying maybe into the Arab world, the political infeasibility became really apparent. And here I am reconnecting it to this beautiful idea of science diplomacy. Can't we solve a solution without thinking about the political, historical adversities, but really connect via the bridge of scientific facts? And then I started thinking about the science diplomacy leadership on climate change. So first I took the science diplomacy index that I just created, and then I pegged it and recreated a new index that also phases in what are the climate change economic gains and loss prospects around the world, what are the CO2 emissions as the cause of climate change of a country, and then again I also took in the science diplomacy. So we have now the economic gains and loss prospects under global warming, we have the CO2 emissions as the cause of climate change, and the science diplomacy. And here you see the redder the country, the more the country not only has a science diplomacy leadership potential, but also an obligation or a natural responsibility to protect or to act on climate change. And that could be that you see here in red is the US, but also the lighter greener country, also Russia. And here this is once I had this result, I really also thought I really want to present this at IIASA, because we had these two blocks, the East, the West, US and Russia, in the past successfully cooperating at IIASA. And potentially this is more the quantification of the argument that was made by Director General Albert van Jaarsveld, that we have to reconnect these amazing powerhouses, these amazing blocks, in order to find a common ground based on facts and an urgent problem. And of course, that also really gives credibility to IIASA to in a time when other people are thinking about building walls and burning down bridges, really more power to IIASA to reconnect and really have these two blocks maintaining lasting relationships that can then help to find common cooperative solutions on large-scale problems. In the last part, I just want to say what other countries could also play a vital role in the climate diplomacy, science diplomacy and climate responsibility index scheme. So we see Japan, India, Germany, UK, Canada, China, South Korea, France, Poland, Mexico, and Brazil really being at the forefront to be not only science diplomacy hubs, but also to have this heightened responsibility and awareness to change something about climate change. And with this, I just remain saying happy birthday, IIASA. Thank you so much for organizing all these great events. We also had an amazing event in May that was hosted at Boston University, and I very much look forward to staying reconnected with you and your amazing researchers, and onwards and upwards into the next 50 years.